This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Today's episode is part of the Speaking of Writers America 250 series, celebrating the people, events, and ideas that help shape the United States as we commemorate America's 250th anniversary. Few relationships in American history are as compelling or as consequential as that of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Political allies, fierce rivals, lifelong correspondents, and two of America's most influential founding fathers. Their relationship helped define the early republic. Then came one of the most extraordinary moments in American history. Both men died on July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, celebrating its 200th anniversary this year. Our guest today, Jim Rasenberger, explores the remarkable story in his new book, A Perfect Coincidence, The Extraordinary Friendship and Astonishing Deaths of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Jim is the acclaimed author of 5 books, including Revolver, The Brilliant Disaster, America, 1908, and High Steel. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Vanity Fair, Smithsonian, and numerous other publications. I am happy to have Jim Rasenberger join me here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Steve.
It's great to have you. So the title of this book comes from Jefferson's own phrase, a perfect coincidence. What did Jefferson mean by those words, and why was it the perfect title for this book?
It's something that Jefferson wrote to Benjamin Rush describing his relationship with John Adams in 1776. We had a perfect coincidence, he said, of principle and action. You might pronounce that coincidence. In other words, it's the original use of the word coincidence, how it was most often used in those days, as agreement. When I found that phrase, I hadn't heard it when I started writing the book. When I came upon them, like, there's my title. Jefferson just gave it to me because, of course, as you alluded to, their lives ended on July 4th, 1826, with the most perfect coincidence in American history. And what's interesting is that coincidence was such a big deal that it actually changed how the word coincidence is used. It had been used mainly in the sense that Jefferson used it in his letter to Rush, describing his relationship with Adams in 1776, or in a mathematical term as in 2 lines or 2 bodies occupying the same space. After 1826, people started using the word coincidence the way we tend to use it now, which is 2 things happening in time, often with a kind of element of surprise and sort of an aha factor. I found this great article by a philologist who studies the history of words, and he traced the beginning of how the word started to change in usage to 1826. And then eventually Merriam-Webster started using the example of Adams and Jefferson as the example, as in the death of Jefferson and Adams, in their definition of the word coincidence. So it was Jefferson gave me a great title, and I think it also just sort of encapsulates what a remarkable event this was, that it literally changed the use of the word.
Yeah, and I was on the tour at Monticello a little over a year ago in Charlottesville, and I definitely recommend, if you've never been, definitely go there. It's beautiful.
I totally agree, yeah.
Standing by his bed, the bed where he passed away that day, I was just thinking, beautiful window he may have been looking out at and thinking of what they accomplished. It had to just be incredible. And I was thinking about that moment in 1826 too.
Yep. Yeah, that remarkable bed too. It's in an alcove. Yeah. It's open on both sides. I think about that moment often. I think about who was with him. I mean, we know of 3 young men who were with him: his doctor, his grandson, and then a grandson-in-law. There was also a slave named Burwell Colbert who was there. I wonder if Sally Hemings was there. Sally Hemings was the slave with whom Jefferson had a long-term relationship and who had several of his children. I'm sure she was in the room too. This is always the problem with history, is you know what you know, but a lot of things never get written down, so you can only speculate.
Yeah. Before they became political opponents, Adams and Jefferson forged a very close friendship during the Revolution. What first brought these 2 very different men together, Jim?
Well, it was independence. It was Jefferson arrived in Philadelphia in 1775, the spring of 1775. So a year before the Declaration. They quickly identified each other as allies. I don't think they were friends originally, but they both knew that they wanted independence. They had made that clear. Everybody knew that from John Adams. He'd been sort of um, agitating for it for at least a year. Jefferson had written something that a pamphlet that made it very clear that he was pro-independence. And you have to recall at the time, even after the battles of Lexington and Concord, even after Bunker Hill, a lot of delegates to Congress still were very much on the fence about independence. They were very worried about it because, among other things, it would be committing treason. Uh, so they identified each other's allies, and they started to work together. They were remarkably different people. That's one of the interesting things in the relationship is Adams was very pugnacious, very adversarial, kind of a loudmouth, where Jefferson was very calm, quiet, kept his own counsel. Adams once said, I heard him say more than three sentences together. But their qualities work together in a perfect coincidence to produce the Declaration of Independence. Adams as its chief advocate, and Jefferson, of course, ultimately as its author.
You have written about a wide range of historical subjects. What inspired you to tell the story of these two founding fathers now?
Well, I always was interested in them. I joke that often that this book was 50 years in the making because I really first became interested in them in 1976 during the bicentennial. I was 13 years old. And I read, my parents had a couple books that had come out around that time, a fabulous biography of Jefferson by Fawn Brodie, and then a book about the Adams family, the four generations, John Adams, John Quincy, and so on. So I always was fascinated. I was fascinated with their relationship. But later on, I mean, you mentioned my other books. I realized there's kind of a theme that runs through them, which is American nationalism or American exceptionalism, I suppose that's what we call it now. And I wrote a book about the Great American Skyscraper. I wrote a book about a year, 1908, when a lot of great American events happened. The Model T started coming off the assembly line. The Wright brothers started flying publicly. And then I also wrote about sort of the downside of American exceptionalism in my book about the Bay of Pigs, A Brilliant Disaster. What I saw in Adams and Jefferson was that this extraordinary personal story brought this theme together in a way that was kind of incredible because their death, even though we sort of think of it as trivia, it was very, very significant when it happened. And many Americans saw it as a sign from God that America was chosen. Have been a long time theme in American history going back to the colonies, but this was seen as many people as proof. And I thought, how did this reflect on their sort of looking backwards? How do you sort of run this theme through their lives? But then also, what effect did this have on the American people afterwards? And I think there is a very clear effect after their deaths, after this sort of miracle had happened, where you can sort of see a rise in American nationalism, this idea that God is we are in God's favor. As John Quincy Adams wrote, the son of John Adams, it was visible and palpable marks of divine favor. Well, what does that mean to the American people in the 1820s and 1830s? I thought that was an interesting thing to explore.
How did two men who shared the dream of American independence become such bitter political rivals?
They shared a different dream, I guess, is the easiest way to put it. They were such close friends, allies in 1776, and became really good friends when they both went to Europe as diplomats. And then they came back and they realized they had a different idea of how the American government should function. Jefferson was a great optimist about people in general and about Americans specifically, and thought they could self-govern. So he thought the least amount of national government, the better. Adams took a pretty grim view of human nature. He thought people were basically selfish, and you needed a very strong national government, well organized, well structured, to stand up to the selfishness of people. That if you just sort of gave government to the people, you'd end up with anarchy that would then lead to tyranny, where the strong would dominate the weak. Jefferson saw what Adams was saying as being sort of that Adams was a proponent of monarchy or anarchy, because Adams kept saying these things are going to happen. There will be these disparities in any society where you will have the haves and the have-nots, you will have the elites and the non-elites. And the way he described it is Jefferson thought he was saying that these things are not only inevitable, but they're necessary. And Adams kept saying to him, no, I'm not saying that they're good or necessary. I'm saying these are the threats we have to watch out for, and this is why we need a strong government. In any case, they ended up on the opposite sides of a great political divide that was widening in the country in the early years. And this turned into first a political difference, turned into a personal difference, and finally they became pretty bitter enemies.
Years later, they reconnected through an extraordinary exchange of letters. What do those letters reveal about both men?
Yeah, I mean, first I just want to say how they connected, I think, is absolutely marvelous. It was a mutual friend of theirs, Benjamin Rush,
Benjamin Rush, right.
had a dream in 1809. And at this point, Adams and Jefferson hadn't exchanged a word in almost a decade. And he wrote to Adams and he said, I've had this dream, and you and Jefferson are going to reconcile, and then you're going to die around the same time. And Adams wrote back and said, yeah, dream on, pal. But finally on January 1st, 1812, Adams wrote this sort of awkward letter to Jefferson. Jefferson wrote back, and on they went, 180 more letters. And it was just this wonderful correspondence. And they talked about everything. These are two of the best educated men in the country, if not the world. And so they could talk about Roman history and the Greek language and the Enlightenment, and of course about American government, and about their families, about their griefs. It's such a wonderful collection of letters because it covers so many things, many of them intellectual topics, and many of them very personal, and ultimately rather affectionate by the time they both died. It's absolutely wonderful, and these letters are available online or in a book. Highly worth reading.
Did spending years researching this book change the way you view either Adams or Jefferson?
Yeah, it did, I think. It made me more disappointed with Thomas Jefferson, not to say that I didn't already know that there were a number of disappointing things about him. But when I was young, I mentioned back during the bicentennial, I loved Jefferson. I just thought he was the most interesting guy ever. But back in those days, we sort of the whole slavery thing, we just sort of put that as a sort of put that aside a little bit. But he really, the way he was about slavery really was pretty hard to reconcile with who he said he was. So his hypocrisy is just, I mean, every historian knows this about Jefferson. His hypocrisy is just a hard thing to wrap your arms around. But also for me, the way he treated Adams, I think, pretty shabbily at times, and made him almost a foil for his own political gain. So that upset me about Jefferson. What I do like about Jefferson, though, in the end, is he had good manners, and it sounds like a small thing, but his good manners made civility possible, and I think they made his reconciliation with Adams possible too. So the thing about Jefferson, there's so many things to not like about them, and then there are these wonderful personal qualities that he had too.
Jim, one of the themes running through your book is that democracy is both powerful and fragile.
Yeah.
Why is that lesson just as relevant today?
Well, I think it's always relevant because democracy always is fragile, and we maybe more now than 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, we recognize that it depends on a certain amount of virtue among the people and virtue in office holders, that we depend on people behaving a certain way. And it's kind of a collective agreement that we all have with each other that we're going to behave well and treat each other with respect. The problem that we've discovered is, I think, particularly with social media, is how easy it is for that to fray when people just start attacking. Not only we attack each other as enemies, not simply that we disagree with each other, but that we're mortal enemies and that we must defeat each other 100%. And we start dehumanizing each other. That makes a democracy a very difficult thing. I think one of the lessons of Jefferson and Adams is they disagreed vehemently about most things, but they had a civil conversation about it. And that within that the bounds of civility, you could disagree, you could even disagree vehemently, but not want to come to blows about it. I think that's one of the most important lessons we can take away from their relationship and ultimately their reconciliation. That clearly would be of value to us now.
Yeah, their reconciliation is remarkable considering the bitterness of their earlier years. I want to come back to July 4th, 1826, celebrating its 200th anniversary today, this year. It's one of the most astonishing coincidences in American history. Can you take us through the final hours?
Yeah. So on July 3rd, the day before, they both were compos mentis. They were ill. They both knew they were on the road, going to die. Jefferson was really wanted to hold on to July 4th. He said it a few times. In fact, to one of the young men at his bedside, he said he took a nap on the 3rd, woke up in the evening, thought it was morning, and he said to the young man next to him, "Is it the 4th?" And the young man, not wanting to disappoint Jefferson, said, "Yes, it's the 4th." He lied to him. Jefferson went back to sleep and did make it into the 4th, but he was kind of out of it the last 12 hours, um, and died around noon on the 4th of July. Adams was more alert until the end, um, in bed, bedbound, sickly, but he woke up that morning and had a conversation with his granddaughter who was tending to him, knew that it was Independence Day, said, "It is a great day. It is a good day." Sort of in and out of not consciousness, but in and out of like, he was resting a lot and was uncomfortable, and then he'd be comfortable. Um, his last words were uttered not long after Jefferson died. Uh, Thomas Jefferson survives. Well, I should say those weren't actually his last words. He then muttered something afterwards to his granddaughter saying, "Help me, child, help me." But that's not such a great story. So we'll go with Thomas Jefferson survives. He did say that. And who knows what he meant? Did he mean that Jefferson was going to outlive him in terms of their legacies, which had sort of become clear by this point? Did he mean that literally, that he thought Jefferson was still alive, even though Jefferson had been dead for about 6 hours by this point? Um, what's I think the one thing we know, I think is fascinating, is one of the last things rattling around in John Adams' head is Thomas Jefferson. He's thinking about Jefferson at the very end of his life. Gives you some sense of how close they were and how much Jefferson meant to John Adams. Adams finally died in the evening, and immediately the news started to spread out from Charlottesville, where Jefferson lived, and from Quincy, Massachusetts, where Adams lived, and spread out in these two sort of separate pools of intelligence. Uh, Everybody was kind of astonished that Jefferson had died on the 4th, that Adams had died on the 4th. But when they realized these guys both died on the 4th, and those pools of news met around Philadelphia, which I think is kind of ironic and interesting. Yeah. It's Philadelphia where they first meet on the 7th of July. And this is when it turns into something like just total gobsmacking astonishment. How could this be that the two men most responsible for the Declaration die on the 50th birthday of that document? It was greeted as a miracle. It was greeted by newspapers as the most extraordinary coincidence in history. One newspaper in Boston called it one of the most important things that ever happened in any history, not just American history. And it did have this very profound effect on Americans.
Jim, what is next for you in your writing? Are you already researching your next historical adventure?
I am researching what to research. So I'm sort of looking and sort of puzzling around with what I want to do next. I mean, there are many books I'd love to write. So I haven't settled on one thing yet. So if you have any great ideas, let me know.
He is Jim Rasenberger, author of A Perfect Coincidence, The Extraordinary Friendship and Astonishing Deaths of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Fascinating and deeply human look at two extraordinary men whose friendship, rivalry, reconciliation, and remarkable final day continue to shape our understanding of America's founding. This is part of our Speaking of Writers America 250 series. This conversation reminds us that the nation's history is not just about events. It's about the people whose ideas, disagreements, and shared commitment help build a republic that continues to evolve. Jim, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
You can find Speaking of Writers on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen and watch your podcasts. Thank you for watching and for listening. I'm Steve Richards. I will talk to you again next time.